Alright, so this is the introductory lecture. I'm going to skip over what we already went over in class, which was not much. Alright, so we're going to go through these different things in a minute, but we're going to cover a couple things about biology as well. So the first off, something fundamental to biology is you have to understand at which scale you are looking at things. So you can go all the way down, like with the elephant example, to the very organization of like the species level, where you're looking at elephants, or you can zoom out and look at the impact of elephants on the savannah. And you can also go very down to the microscopic levels, where you're looking at what makes up specific hormones that affect the elephant behavior and stuff like that. So all of these levels of organization have different aspects within the study of biology. So from smallest to biggest, we're going to start actually in this course talking about atoms and molecules, and then get into macromolecules, organelles, cells, so on and so forth, and kind of get larger. And the class kind of starts at stops really in this first set of organizations, and then Bio 202, you will learn some of the larger organismal levels. So one thing we have to kind of backtrack and talk about then before we talk about, or as we talk about biology, is this concept of what is science and what science is. So my definition, and this is the one I want you to know, is the formulation and or discrediting of objective explanations for the observations and phenomena of the physical and biological universe. So really taking into account theories for how and why things work, and then there's a process there for testing those theories. And here's a couple other definitions that I'm not going to go over, but this is from dictionary.com. All of them, you can see within them is this idea of a process whereby you find what is actually true and discard what isn't. So some of the ways that we do that: first, in order to come up with questions, we have to make observations, and we have to use logic within those observations to make our theories. So logic may fall into one of two major components, including deductive reasoning, where you take general principles and apply them to specific results. Okay, and then inductive, and this is what kind of Sherlock Holmes does, where he sees patterns of behavior and is able to predict then how a person acts based on those patterns of behavior, deducing. Inductive reasoning then is applying scientific observations to a universal application, and these usually fall under what we call theories or laws. And so Newton's laws of physics applied to all things in motion, or at least he thought, and then Einstein came out with different equations which were more comprehensive, and so on and so forth. In science, we look at variables. Variables are any factors that may or may not have an influence on an outcome of an observation. Controls, then, we need controls to be able to test different variables, and when we do an experiment, we need to have a control as comparison for that experiment. And so we may have a positive or negative control, something where we know is going to have what we know is going to happen, a positive result, and something where we know there's going to be a negative result. And so all those are important for having a test experiment. And this is where we have two tests done side by side. In one test, the variable is changed, in the other, no variables are changed, and any of the difference between the two we can attribute to what we changed, that variable. And the scientific method then kind of goes through these different processes, which we described a little bit before. First, you have to make an observation and ask a question, and from those observations you make a hypothesis where you think you know what the outcome is and you know why it is happening, and then you test that with an experiment. Now you may be testing multiple hypotheses at the same time, or you may have multiple experiments to test one hypothesis. But at any rate, it's not as clean cut as just kind of a step-by-step process, but more of a trial and error and continuing process that is the scientific method. Rarely, if ever, do you have an experiment where it's very clear cut and the answer is only answering our original hypothesis. Many times when you get to the conclusion, you have more questions than when you started. But in this process, some hypotheses are rejected, some of them are revised, and some of them are discarded altogether. So this is probably something we will do in class, where we're actually coming up with some scientific methods, but we won't do that in our video lecture. All right, so scientific research, where researchers then look at these observations and processes and things and make hypotheses and test them, can be done in a couple different ways. One is basic research, and this is where scientists conduct these experiments through the scientific method in order to broaden the bounds of what we know. And this is generally done by scientists at universities funded by grants. There are some labs which are not funded by universities, kind of by themselves, but the ones that are for profit then would be applied research, and this is taking those basic research findings from basic research and finding applications for them in life. And so some examples of that are like DuPont and Monsanto, which is a agricultural company, Dow and Pfizer. Pfizer is a pharmaceutical company, and Dow is an industrial chemical company. Okay, so some of the unifying themes of biology, which also touch on some of the things we talked about as far as what defines life, include our cell theory, the molecular basis of inheritance, the combination of structure and function, evolution, and homeostasis. Okay, so cell theory is that everything is made of cells. Every living thing is made of cells. Molecular basis of inheritance is that DNA encodes for the processes of life. The structure and function is that the structure of something relates to its function, and you can see that would be why this humerus, this bone in the arm, is shaped the way it is, because of the muscles that are attached to it and the function of those muscles. Finally, evolution then. We have here, this is the fossil record, which shows the different steps in the evolution of whales. And finally, we have homeostasis, where we have an internal environment where we can regulate internally to adjust for things externally. So the cell theory was first observed by, cells were first observed by Robert Hooke in England in 1665 with a microscope. Schleiden and Schwann were the ones that originally came up with cell theory, which is that all living things are made of cells, and all cells come from pre-existing cells. Okay, within these cells you have DNA. Okay, and this contains sequences in the form of 4 different base pairs that can be passed in different arrangements from generation to generation, and that's what gives what we call genes, which code then for certain proteins, and proteins then take the action of life. They are the ones that are actually doing things in your cells. One of these proteins is hemoglobin, so that's what I have here. On the right you have 2 red and 2 blue subgroups, which makes this, kind of looks just like a big scribbly mess. But what it is 4 different of these subunits to the left in light blue, all combined to make a molecule, and the structure of this molecule applies to its function. Because of the way it's shaped, it has a heme group in the middle, which attaches to oxygen. It is able to carry 4 oxygens in red blood cells, and if it was shaped differently, if you have just one mutation on this sequence of proteins or amino acids which make the protein, then it's not going to function. So how it's shaped is very important. Finally, evolution. Now, evolution is gets a lot of press as being in the news, kind of a controversial subject, but within the realm of biology, it's how most things are understood. So it's a theory which has stood the test of time and is the best theory, or the best best known way of thinking, which explains the most phenomena in biology. It accounts for the diversity among organisms, so why we have so many different types. One of the fundamental things of it is that all living things are descendants from a common ancestor. And what evolution allows us to do is to infer relationships among living and extinct organisms and answer questions like why species have certain anatomical proportions compared to others. Homeostasis then is requiring a constant input of energy. We've talked about this a couple times. And within the range of homeostasis, you have also conditions which will not allow life. And so within the range which allows life, you need a constant input of energy. You need the ability to make sense of your environment and be able to, like, is it light? Is it too dark? Is it too hot? And other things. It also requires storage and processing of information, whether it be energy or some sort of way to make sense of the outside world. It requires changes in response to the environment. So when we're too hot, we will sweat. When we're too cold, we will shiver. And this is accomplished through a network of cells and their interactions and their communications between them. So one example of homeostasis is the fight or flight response. So if you're walking in the woods and you come across a bear, you sense that you are in danger. Well, there are certain hormones, adrenaline being one, which will start to activate certain parts of your body. It'll cause you to breathe heavily. It'll cause you to tense up. And more than likely, you will start to run, and you will be, and all the systems involved in running will be activated, including your heart will pump faster and other things. So that's an example of homeostasis, where you're sensing your environment and then making the appropriate changes internally so that you can stay alive.